The Servant Girl Annihilator, the unsolved murders of 1885 in Austin, Texas. In 1885, a series of brutal murders shocked the city of Austin, Texas, leaving the public terrified and law enforcement baffled. The killer, dubbed the Servant Girl Annihilator, murdered at least 8 people, mostly African American women who worked as domestic servants. The murders were savage, with the victims often bludgeoned to death with an axe, and some showing signs of sexual assault and mutilation. Despite intense investigation and the arrest of several suspects, the killer was never caught, and the case remains unsolved to this day. The killing spree began on December 30, 1884, when Molly Smith, a young African-American woman, was found brutally murdered in her home. She had been dragged from her bed, bludgeoned with an axe, and mutilated. The scene was grisly, and police were stunned by the savagery of the attack. Just a few weeks later, in January 1885, another servant girl, Eliza Shelley, was found murdered in a similarly brutal fashion. Over the next few months, more victims were claimed by the killer, all with similar circumstances. The killer seemed to target African American servant girls, most of whom were attacked in their homes while they slept. The bodies were often found with severe head injuries caused by an axe or other blunt object, and some victims were dragged outside, where they were mutilated. In a few cases, the killer left behind footprints, but no solid clues emerged that could lead to an arrest. The terror reached its peak in December 1885, when 2 white women, Eula Phillips and Susan Hancock, were murdered on the same night. This raised alarm bells across the city, as the killer had previously focused on African American women. The sudden change in the racial profile of the victims added to the confusion surrounding the killer's motives. The Austin Police Department and local authorities struggled to keep up with the killer, who seemed to strike at will. Several suspects were arrested over the course of the investigation, but none were ever convicted. Some of those arrested included domestic workers, husbands of the victims, and even prominent figures in the community, but none of these individuals were definitively linked to the murders. One of the most notable suspects was a man named Nathan Elgin, who was shot and killed by police while resisting arrest for another crime in 1886. Some believe Elgin may have been the Servant Girl Annihilator, but there was never enough evidence to conclusively tie him to the murders. Another theory suggested that the killer may have been a member of the upper class, given the different racial and social backgrounds of the victims. Some investigators even speculated that the Servant Girl Annihilator could have been Jack the Ripper, as the infamous London killer's murders occurred just a few years later in 1888. However, no solid connections were ever made between the 2 cases. The killer's methods. The Servant Girl Annihilator was known for his brutal and methodical approach to murder. His victims were typically young women who worked as domestic servants, and most were attacked while they were asleep. The killer often used an axe to bludgeon his victims, and some of the women were mutilated, with deep gashes and wounds found on their bodies. The killer's ability to evade capture for so long led many to believe that he was familiar with the city's layout and its neighborhoods. The attacks were spread out across Austin, and there was no clear pattern to the timing of the murders. This made it difficult for law enforcement to predict where the killer might strike next. The end of the murders. After the murders of Eula Phillips and Susan Hancock in December 1885, the killings abruptly stopped. The city of Austin, which had been living in fear for over a year, was left without answers as to who the Servant Girl Annihilator was or why he stopped killing. Despite the lack of new murders, the mystery of the killer's identity continued to haunt the city for decades. Legacy and theories. The Servant Girl Annihilator case remains one of the oldest unsolved serial murder cases in U.S. history, and the mystery continues to fascinate historians and true crime enthusiasts. Some believe that the killer may have fled the city or died, which is why the murders stopped so suddenly. Others speculate that the killer may have been arrested for an unrelated crime, preventing him from continuing his spree. The case has also drawn comparisons to the infamous Jack the Ripper murders in London, as both killers targeted vulnerable women and mutilated their bodies. However, there is no definitive proof linking the two cases, and most experts believe they were the work of different individuals. Despite modern advancements in forensic science, the lack of preserved evidence from the 1880s makes it unlikely that the Servant Girl Annihilator will ever be identified. The case remains one of Austin's most notorious and baffling mysteries. The killer still at large, the Servant Girl Annihilator, was never caught, and his identity remains unknown to this day. For over a year, he terrorized the city of Austin, leaving a trail of blood and fear in his wake. The case, now over a century old, continues to capture the imagination of those who study serial killers and unsolved mysteries. Whoever the killer was, he escaped justice, leaving behind one of the most chilling unsolved cases in American history.